Good morning. This is a live reading of the Left Behind series. We are on the third book, which is called Nicolae, and I am ready to read chapter 2. So enjoy along with me. The Learjet was a six-seater. Carpathia and Fortunato, deep in conversation, ignored Rayford and Amanda as the couple passed. The Steeles ducked into the last two seats and held hands. Rayford knew global terror was entirely new to Amanda. It was new to him. On this scale, it was new to everyone. She gripped his hand so tight his fingers turned white. She was shuddering. Carpathia turned in his seat to face them. He had that fighting a grin look Rayford found so maddening in light of the situation. I know you are not certified on these little speedsters, Carpathia said, but you might learn something in the co-pilot's chair. Rayford was much more worried about the plane. He would be expected to fly out of Dallas, something he had never seen or even heard of. He looked at Amanda, hoping she would plead with him to stay with her, but she quickly let go of his hand and nodded. Rayford climbed toward the cockpit, which was separated from the other seats by a thin panel. He strapped himself in and looked apologetically at the pilot, who offered his hand and said, Chico Hernandez. Captain Steele, don't worry, I've already done the pre-flight check and I don't really need any help. I wouldn't be of any help anyway, Rayford said. I haven't flown anything smaller than a 707 for years. Compared to what you usually fly, Hernandez said, this will seem like a motorbike. And that's exactly what it seemed to Rayford. The Learjet screamed and whined as Hernandez carefully lined it up on the runway. They seemed to hit top ground speed in seconds and quickly lifted off, banking hard to the right and setting a course for Dallas. What tower do you connect with? Rayford asked. The tower's empty at Glenview, Hernandez said. I noticed. I'll let a few towers know I'm coming along the way. The weather people tell us we're clear all the way, and global community intelligence spots no enemy aircraft between here and touchdown. Enemy aircraft, Rayford thought. Here's an interesting way to refer to American militia forces. He recalled not liking the militias, not understanding them, assuming them criminals. But that had been when the American government was also their enemy. Now they were allies of lame duck United States President Gerald Fitzhugh, and their enemy was Rayford's enemy, his boss, of all things, but his enemy nonetheless. Rayford had no idea where Hernandez came from, what his background was, whether he was sympathetic and loyal to Carpathia or had been pressed into reluctant services as Rayford himself had. Rayford slipped on earphones and found the proper dial so he could communicate to the pilot without allowing for anyone else to hear. This is your pretend first officer, he said softly. Do you read me? Loud and clear, co-pilot, Hernandez said. And as if reading Rayford's mind, Hernandez added, this channel is secure. Rayford took that to mean that no one else, inside or outside the plane, could hear their conversation. That made sense, but why had Hernandez said that? Had he realized that Rayford wanted to talk? And how comfortable would Rayford be talking to a stranger? Just because they were fellow pilots didn't mean he could bare his soul to this man. I'm curious about Global Community 1, Rayford said. You haven't heard? Hernandez asked. Negative. Hernandez shot a glance behind him at Carpathia and Fortunato. Rayford chose not to turn so as not to arouse any suspicion. Apparently Hernandez had found Carpathia and Fortunato in earnest discussions again, because he told what he knew about Rayford's former plane. I suppose the potentate would have told you himself if he had the chance, Hernandez said. There's not good news of New York. I heard that, Rayford said, but I hadn't heard how widespread the damage was at the major airports. Just about total destruction, I understand. We know for sure that the hangar where she was located was virtually vaporized. And the pilot? Earl Halliday? He was long gone by the time of the attack. He's safe then, Rayford said. That's a relief. Do you know him? Not personally, Hernandez said, but I've heard a lot about him in the past few weeks. From Carpathia, Rayford said. No, from the North American delegation to the global community. Rayford was lost, but he didn't want to admit it. Why would the North American delegation be talking about Earl Halliday? Carpathia had asked Rayford to find someone to fly the Global Community 777 to New York while Rayford and Amanda were taking a brief vacation in Chicago. Carpathia was to spend a few days confusing the press and the President Fitzhugh and several American militia groups, but by ignoring his published itinerary and being shuttled from place to place. When the militia attacked and the global community retaliated, Rayford had assumed that at least the timing was a surprise. He also assumed that his selection of his old friend and boss at Pan-Continental Airlines as the one to ferry this empty 777 to New York was of little consequence to Nicolae Carpathia, but apparently Carpathia and the North American delegation had known exactly whom he would choose. What was the point of that? And how did Halliday know to get out of New York in time to avoid being killed? Where is Halliday now? Rayford asked. You'll see him in Dallas. Rayford squinted and trying to make it all commute. I will? Who did you think was going to take you through the paces of the new aircraft? When Carpathia had told Rayford he might learn a few things by sitting in the co-pilot chair, Rayford had no idea it would entail more than a few interesting tidbits about this quick small jet. Let me get this straight, he said. Earl Halliday knew about the new plane and is conversant enough to teach me to drive it. Hernandez smiled as he scanned the horizon and maneuvered the Learjet. Earl Halliday practically built the Condor 216 himself. He helped design it. He made sure everyone who was certified on a 777 would be able to fly it, even though it's much bigger and a whole sight more sophisticated than Global Community 1. Rayford felt an ironic emotion rise within him. He hated Carpathia and knew precisely who he was, but as strange as his wife's taking offense at Carpathia's insistence on getting her name wrong, Rayford suddenly felt left out of the loop. I wonder why I would not have been informed of a new plane, especially if I am supposed to be its pilot, he said. I can't say for sure, Hernandez said, but you know the potent tends to be very wary, very careful, and very calculating. Don't I know it, Rayford thought. Conniving and scheming is more like it. So he apparently doesn't trust me. I'm not sure he trusts anyone, Hernandez said. If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't either. Would you? Would I what? Would you trust anyone if you were Carpathia? Hernandez said. Rayford did not respond. Do you feel like you just spent the devil's money? Chloe asked Buck as he carefully pulled the beautiful new earth tone Range Rover out of the dealership and into traffic. I know I did, Buck said, and the Antichrist has never invested a better dollar for the cause of God. You consider spending almost $100,000 on a toy like this an investment in our cause? Chloe, Buck said carefully, look at this rig. It has everything. It will go anywhere. It's indestructible. It comes with a satellite phone. It comes with a Citizens Band radio. It comes with a fire extinguisher, a survival kit, flares, you name it. It has four-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, independent suspension, a CD player that plays those new 2-inch jobs, electrical outlets, you name it. But Buck, you slapped down your Global Community Weekly credit card as if it were your own. What kind of a limit do you have on that thing? Most of the cards Carpathia issues like this have $250,000 limit, Buck said, but those of us at senior level have a special code built into ours. They're unlimited. Literally unlimited. Didn't you see the eyes of that sales manager when he phoned for verification? All I saw, Chloe said, was a smile and a done deal. There you go. But doesn't somebody have to approve purchases like that? I report directly to Carpathia. He might want to know why I bought a Range Rover, but it should certainly be easy enough to explain with what the loss of our apartment, our vehicles, and the need to be able to get wherever we have to go. Once again, Buck soon grew impatient with the traffic. This time, when he left the road and made his way through ditches, gullies, parkways, alleys, and yards, the ride was sure, and, if not smooth, purposeful. The vehicle was made of this kind of driving, for this kind of driving. Look what else this baby has, Buck said. You could switch between automatic or manual transmission. Chloe leaned down to look at the floorboard. What do you do with the clutch when you're in automatic? You ignore it, Buck said. You ever drive a stick shift? You ever drive a stick? A friend in college had a little foreign sports car with a stick shift, she said. I loved it. You want to drive? Not on your life, at least not now. Let's just get to the church. Anything else I should know about what we're going to encounter in Dallas? Rayford asked Hernandez. You're going to be ferrying a lot of VIPs back to Iraq, Hernandez said. But that's nothing new for you, is it? Nope, I'm afraid it's lost its luster by now. Well, for what it's worth, I envy you. Rayford was stunned to silence. Here he was, what Bruce Barnes referred to as a tribulation saint, a believer in Christ during the most horrifying period in human history, serving Antichrist himself against his own will, and certainly at the peril of his wife, his daughter, her husband, and himself, and yet he was envied. Don't envy me, Captain Hernandez. Whatever you do, don't envy me. As Buck neared the church, he noticed yards full of people. They stared at the sky and listened to radios and TVs that blared from inside their houses. Buck was surprised to see one lone car in the parking lot at New Hope. It belonged to Loretta, Bruce's assistant. I don't look forward to this, Chloe said. I hear you, Buck said. They found the woman, now nearly 70, sitting stiffly in the outer office staring at the television. Two balled-up tissues rested in her lap, and she riffled a third in her bony fingers. Her reading glasses rode low on her nose, and she peered over the top of them at the television. She did not seem to look Buck and Chloe's way as they entered, but it soon became clear she knew they were there. From the inner office, Buck heard a computer printing, producing page after page after page. Loretta had been a Southern belle in her day. Now she sat red-eyed and sniffling, fingers working that tissue as if creating some piece of art. Buck glanced up to see a helicopter view of the bombed-out Northwest Community Hospital. People been calling, Loretta said. I don't know what to tell 'em. He couldn't survive that, could he? Pastor Bruce, I mean. He couldn't still be alive now, could he? Did you all see him? We didn't see him, Chloe said carefully, kneeling next to the old woman, but my dad did. Loretta turned quickly to stare at her. Mr. Steele saw him, and is he all right? Chloe shook her head. I'm sorry, ma'am, he's not. Bruce is gone. Loretta lowered her chin to her chest. Tears gathered and pooled in her half glasses. She spoke hoarsely. Would you all mind turning that off then, please? I was just praying I'd catch a glimpse of Pastor Bruce. But if he's under one of those sheets, I don't care to see that. Buck turned off the TV as Chloe embraced the old woman. Loretta broke down and sobbed. That young man was like family to me, you know. We know, Chloe said, crying herself now. He was family to us, too. Loretta pulled back to look at Chloe, but he was my only family. You know my story, don't you? Yes, ma'am. You know I lost everybody. Yes, ma'am. I mean everybody. I lost every living relative I had, more than 100. I came from one of the most devout spiritual heritages a woman could come from. I was considered a pillar of this church. I was active in everything, a church woman. I just never really knew the Lord. Chloe held her close and cried with her. That young man taught me everything, Loretta continued. I learned more from him in 2 years than I learned in more than 60 years in Sunday school and church before that. I'm not blaming anybody but myself. I was deaf and blind spiritually. My daddy had gone on before, but I lost Mama, all 6 of my brothers and sisters, all of my kids, their kids, husbands, and wives. I lost my own children and grandchildren. Everybody. If somebody had made a list of who in this church would be most likely to go to heaven when they died, I would have been at the top of the list right there with the pastor. This was as painful for Buck as it seemed for Chloe and Loretta. He would grieve in his own way in his own time, but for now he didn't want to dwell on the tragedy. "What are you working on in the office, ma'am?" he said. Loretta cleared her throat. "Bruce's stuff, of course," she managed. "What is it?" "Well, when he got back from that big teaching trip of his in Indonesia, he had some sort of a virus or something. One of the men rushed him to the hospital so fast that he left his laptop computer here. He took that thing with him everywhere he went." "I know he did," Chloe said. "Well, as soon as he was settled in at hospital, he called me. He asked me to bring that laptop to him if I could. I would have done anything for Bruce, of course. I was on my way out the door with it when the phone rang again. Bruce told me they were taking him out of the emergency room and straight to intensive care so he wouldn't be able to have any visitors for a while. I think he had a premonition. "A premonition," Buck said. "I think he knew he might die," she said. "He told me to keep in touch with the hospital for when he could have visitors. He was fond of me, but I know he wanted that laptop more than he wanted to see me." "I'm not so sure about that," Chloe said. "He loved you like a mother." "I know that's true," Loretta said. "He told me that more than once. Anyway, he asked if I would print out everything he had on his hard drive of his computer. Everything except what he called program files and all that." "What?" Chloe asked. "His own Bible studies and sermon preparations, stuff like that?" "I guess," Loretta said. "He told me to make sure I had plenty of paper. I thought he meant like just a ream or something." "It's taken more than that," Buck said. "Oh, yes, sir, much more than that. I stood there feeding that machine every 200 pages or so until I'd finished up 2 reams. I'm scared to death of those computers, but Bruce talked me through how to print out everything that had a file name that began with his initials. He told me if I just typed in print BB that it would spit out everything he wanted. I sure hope I did the right thing. It's given him more than he could ever want. I suppose I should just shut it down now." "You got a third ream going in there?" Chloe said. "No, I got some help from Donnie." "The phone guy?" Buck said. "Oh, Donnie Moore is a whole lot more than just a phone guy," Loretta said. "There's hardly anything electronic he can't fix or make better. He showed me how I can use those old boxes of continuous feed computer paper and our laser printer. He just hauled the box out and fed it in one end and it comes out the other, so I don't have to keep feeding it." "I didn't know you could do that," Buck said. "Neither did I," Loretta said. "There's a lot of stuff Donnie knows that I don't. He said our printer was pretty new and fancy and he should be kicking out close to a page a second." "And you've been doing this how long?" Chloe said. "Just about ever since I talked to Bruce from the hospital this morning. There was probably a 5 or 10 minute break after those first 2 reams and before Donnie helped me get that big box of paper under there." Bruce slipped into the inner office and stood watching in amazement as the high-tech printer drew page after page from the paper box through its innards and out the other side into a stack that was threatening to topple. He straightened the stack and stared at the box. The first 2 reams of printed material, all single space, lay neatly on Bruce's desk. The old paper box, the likes of which Buck hadn't seen in years, noted that it contained 5,000 sheets. He guessed that it had already used 80% of its total. Surely there must be some mistake. Could Bruce have produced more than 5,000 pages of notes? Perhaps there was a glitch and Loretta had mistakenly printed everything, including program files, Bibles, and concordance, dictionaries, and the like. But there had been no glitch. Buck casually fanned through first one ream and then the other, looking for something other than Bruce's own notes. Every page Buck glanced at contained personal writings from Bruce. This included his own commentary on Bible passages, sermon notes, devotional thoughts, and letters to friends and relatives and churchmen from around the globe. At first, Buck felt guilty, as if he were invading Bruce's privacy. And yet, why had Bruce urged Loretta to print all this stuff? Was he afraid he might be gone? Had he wanted to leave it for their use? Buck bent over the first rising stack of continuous feed sheets. He lifted it from the bottom and allowed the pages to drop before his eyes one at a time. Again, page after page of single-spaced copy, all from Bruce. He must have written several pages a day for more than 2 years. When Buck rejoined Chloe and Loretta, Loretta said again, We might as well shut it off and throw the pages away. He'll have no use for all that stuff now. Chloe had risen and now sat, looking exhausted in a side chair. It was Buck's turn to kneel before Loretta. He placed his hands on her shoulders and spoke earnestly. Loretta, you can still serve the Lord by serving Bruce. She began to protest, but he continued. He's gone, yes, but we can rejoice that he's with his family again, can't we? Loretta pressed her lips together and nodded. Buck continued, I need your help on a big project. There's a gold mine in that room. From just glancing at those pages, I can see that Bruce is still with us. His knowledge, his teaching, his love and compassion, they are all there. The best we can do for this little flock that has lost its shepherd is to get those pages reproduced. I don't know what this place will do for a pastor or a teacher, but in the meantime, people need access to what Bruce has written. Maybe they've heard him preach it, maybe they've seen it in other forms before, but this is a treasure that everyone can use. Chloe spoke up. Buck, shouldn't you try to edit it or shape it into some sort of book from form first? I'll take a look at it, Chloe, but there's a certain beauty in simply reproducing it in the form it's in. This was Bruce's off the cuff in the middle of his study, writing to fellow believers, writing to friends and loved ones, writing to himself. I think Loretta ought to take all those pages to a quick print shop and get them started. We need 1,000 copies of all that stuff, printed on 2 sides and bound simply. That'll cost a fortune, Loretta said. Don't worry about that now, Buck said. I can't think of a better investment. As the Learjet made its initial descent into the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Fortunato ducked into the cockpit and knelt between Hernandez and Rayford. Each slipped the headphone off, the ear closest to Carpathia's aide. Anybody hungry? He said. Rayford hadn't even thought of food. For all he knew, the world was blowing itself to bits, and no one would survive this war. The very mention of hunger, however, triggered something in him. He realized he was famished. He knew Amanda would be as well. She was a light eater, and he often had to make sure she remembered to eat. I could eat, Hernandez said. In fact, I could eat a lot. Lieutenant Carpathia would like you to contact DFW Tower and have something nice waiting for us. Hernandez suddenly looked panicky. What do you think he means by something nice? I'm sure you'll arrange for something appropriate, Captain Hernandez. Fortunato backed out of the cockpit, and Hernandez rolled his eyes at Rayford. DFW Tower, this is Global Community 3, over. Rayford glanced back at Fortunato, took his seat. Carpathia had swung around and was in deep conversation with Amanda. Chloe worked with Loretta in fashioning a terse 2-sentence statement that was sent out by phone to the 6 names at the top of the prayer chain list. Each would call others who would call others, and the news would quickly spread throughout the New Hope body. Meanwhile, Buck recorded a brief message on the answering machine that simply said, the tragic news of Pastor Bruce's death is true. Elder Rayford still saw him and believes he may have died before any explosives hit the hospital. Please do not come to the church, as there will be no meeting or services or further announcements until Sunday at the regular time. Buck turned the ringer off on the phone and directed all calls to the answering machine, which soon began clicking every few minutes. As more and more parishioners called in for confirmation, Buck knew Sunday morning's meeting would be packed. Chloe agreed to follow Loretta home and make sure she was all right, while Buck was calling Donnie Moore. Donnie, Buck said, I need your advice. I need it right away. Mr. Williams, sir, came Donnie's characteristic delivery. Advice is my middle name, and as you know, I work at home, so I can come to you or you can come to me, and we can talk whenever you want. Donnie, I'm not mobile just now, so if you could find your way clear to visiting me at the church, I'd sure appreciate it. I'll be right over, Mr. Williams, but could you tell me something first? Did Loretta have the phones off of the hook there for a while? Yes, I believe she did. She didn't have answers for people who were calling about Pastor Bruce. With nothing to tell people, she just turned off the phones. That's a relief, Donnie said. I just got her set up with a new system a few weeks ago, so I hope nothing was wrong. How is Bruce, by the way? And that is the end of the chapter. And we will begin to read the next chapter tomorrow. Thank you for coming, and you're free to go.